So I guess just some info on me. I actually used to be like a huge fan of emulators, as I definitely still am, honestly, because I use them every now and then. But I've definitely shuffled between, especially in the past year or so, of changing how I play video games. That I kind of have this shift of like I used to use emulators for like everything, and now I kind of flip flop between like playing things on hardware versus emulation. And I kind of want to talk about my experiences with it and kind of talk about the emulation scene as a whole, because I think there's a lot of discussion around like the best way to play. And to be honest, I don't know if there really is, honestly, just because they're such different things with such different use cases. And my 3DS video did extremely well, and I really enjoyed that topic. And this kind of seems like a sequel to that video to a degree. So I really wanted to kind of keep on going with this topic. So in this video, I'll be talking about emulators, my own experiences with them. I'll be talking about where I think they actually work really well, and I'll be talking about where I think they may not be the best use case. So if that interests you, then feel free to stick around, and I guess we'll get started. So I guess I'll get started with my own stance on emulators just to get that out of the way. But I think emulators are very cool. I used to use them for a lot of stuff. Just trying to think of an example. I think the best example of something that I actively use emulators for is specifically Rhythm Heaven. I've just found that that's the best way for me to experience that game when I do want to play it. It just works better for me with like a mouse. I'm gonna use Fever as an example, just because that's the one I mostly use emulation for. I personally find that's the best way to play, just because I'm used to the mouse controls. And then I feel like with rhythm games, once you kind of figure out like your control set, it just becomes far too intuitive to like want to switch them. So that would be the example of the one thing that's consistently persisted with me as like how I prefer to play like on an emulator. There definitely are some other games I've done with emulators. Like I've tried Pokemon on emulator. I've tried other Rhythm Heaven stuff on emulator. I tried, what was it, Delta for a while. I think Delta's really, really, really cool. I've seen some stuff. I even tried it myself with the, with like, how do I word it? I don't know how to word it. I'm going to put a picture up on screen right now of what I'm talking about. But I've seen people who take like the DS set and they make it into like a big like dual screen thing where they're playing on like a TV, but then they have like the handheld console in their hands. I think that's such a cool setup. And I've tried it before. Even one of the pictures is actually mine. I'll probably label which, but I think that's genuinely extremely cool. Like a way, to use emulators. I think there are really a lot of use cases for emulators where I don't think it's like simply like, oh, use emulators or oh, don't use emulators. Like I'm thinking like ROM hacks for like a lot of like Pokemon ROM hacks, the modding scene around like emulation and stuff, all the upscaling, the fact that you get like such higher quality video games like, for Citra and stuff, how it does like the upscaling. Like I think that's really cool for emulation. And as I say, there's definitely a lot of stuff that like people are still working with these older games and just trying to keep modernizing them. And I think that's such an awesome scene to have in gaming, So I guess that's my stance on emulation. So I wanted to get next into like kind of where I think emulators shine and where they don't shine for others. So we'll go there next. So I guess the first place to start will probably be like the actual like people who benefit from emulators the most. I think there's probably a couple like small handful of like traits that I would say where that kind of shines the best. The first one would be people who prefer like exclusively digital libraries, who want, who just want their games easy and accessible, who don't really care about physical collections, who don't want, like having game cartridges and worrying about losing them. Some people just want their stuff digitally, and emulation is probably the easiest way to guarantee that you could do that. So I think that's generally a huge plus for people who prefer that. I'm kind of that, but also not really. So there definitely is a crowd for that. I know some people only want physical games or prefer owning their games. Some people just want digital because it's easy. So there's definitely a split with that. I think another big one is actually how many games you could actually experience. Some people want as many different emulators as possible to play as many games as possible and experience as many, either retro or modern platforms as possible, just in one consolidated space. Like, even with like, I always say like the Steam Deck, people love the Steam Deck because it's like a very advanced piece of hardware. And, you're getting so many sources of emulation in like one little handheld, and people love that. And I completely understand it, or even like gaming PCs. People get a gaming PC, they just want to consolidate all their emulation stuff into that one piece of hardware. That's a very understandable place to be with emulation, and I completely understand that as a place to be. What else? Portability, I think, is another one too. I think this one kind of depends because, as I said, the Steam Deck exists, but other people just don't want to buy more pieces of hardware. Like some people don't want to buy, say, like a PlayStation to experience PlayStation games. They don't want to buy, a Switch or Nintendo hardware to experience Nintendo games. So there definitely is that use case of like, I just want everything in one spot, and emulation does provide that very much easily to anyone who wants it. That's kind of like portability plus like, ecosystem stuff. Like some people don't really want like, a Switch and the 3DS, or, they don't want the PlayStation, or they don't want, say like Xbox. Some people just want like one place to experience everything and like call it a day at that. Some people prefer that kind of flexibility, and that's a very understandable place to be. Like, yeah, you know, if your priority is access and flexibility, then I think in that context, emulation is probably like one of the best ways to experience video games, just period. But I think there's also a flip side to this where emulation isn't really the best answer, and I think there are people who benefit from playing on original hardware, so I think we'll go there next. So I think with just playing on original hardware, there's actually a lot of arguments for playing on it, and I guess I'll go into those now. So I think the biggest one, or at least one of them, is probably just the ease of use, right? Like when you pick up a video game and you just put it into like a console and you just boot it up and it works. Like a lot of people just like to enjoy their technology like that. It's a very understandable place to be. Some people prefer, you know, having like for the emulation crowd, some people prefer messing with settings, trying to, you know, maximize graphic capability, you know, messing with stuff, tinkering with stuff. That's a completely understandable place to be. It's just not what everyone prefers, you know. What else? There's, you know, like settings modifications, like troubleshooting, you know, kind of just figuring out stuff, setting up the emulators, picking out your game library, you know, downloading stuff. There's a lot of work that goes into it, you know. And I know some people don't prefer that. Some people just want something that, you know, you go to the store, you buy something from like an eShop or something, and it's just there and it's done. You know, some people prefer that. Other people want it to be a project. And I think both are very understandable use cases. It's just a matter of picking, you know, am I A or am I B, you know. So what else? I think another thing too is I think another big reason that I don't see much talked about is probably hardware itself. Like some games just feel substantially better when you're playing them on source hardware, and you know they just, you know, I don't know how to describe it. Like it's just some games just feel so much better to play like on the source hardware. I guess Pokemon's probably my best example, but that didn't click for me until I really started playing on a Switch, you know, like when I had access to home, when I had access to, you know, all the games, when it just felt like it was on like a handheld where it was meant to belong. Not that emulation's the wrong way to play, it's just that for me at least, it just felt a lot different when I was playing it with like, you know, with controls, with, you know, that's kind of when I stuck around with the franchise, was when I kind of felt like one big coherent like ecosystem and not like individual experiences. Which I guess ties me into my other point, which is I guess the lack of like first party software availability. So by that, I mean, I think a lot of stuff is like, I always use Pokemon Home as like my example of like what I mean by this, but with emulation, you don't tend to get access to a lot of like services that like you do otherwise get with, say, like Pokemon Home, you know. That doesn't exist on emulation, only exists on original hardware. That's probably that's always the reason I say that I got a 3DS, was just because Pokemon Home was kind of what sold me over as like my, oh man, like this is kind of like my winner over anything else decision, you know. I was like, do I get a Steam Deck? Do I get a 3DS? And then like once I figure out like Home and how, or I guess it'd be Bank on the 3DS. Once I figured out like Bank was only on 3DS, I was like, you know what, this is like my seller that'll get the 3DS, and I don't regret that decision in the slightest. I love Home and Bank and stuff, so that's my main point with that. Is just that like you don't get those first party software, you don't get, you know, like the you don't get really the seamlessness of it on emulation. That could be not a drawback for other players because some people just don't care about it, but for others that's a, you know, like a deal breaker. So I think there is also that split too. I think that's really important to kind of drive home with this. So I think the main like thesis I'm trying to get at with all this, just to wrap this up and kind of close out my thoughts, is I think emulation overall optimizes the best for capability, while consoles generally tend to optimize the hardest for trust. And in my opinion, I don't think either emulation or console and first like original hardware is objectively a better experience. It just depends on what you're after. And, you know, as I say, I've tried emulation. I've used emulation. You know, I say I don't condemn emulation in the slightest. I think it's an awesome alternative with a lot of really cool use cases. It's just not for everyone. And I think it's not worth trying to advertise it as being for everyone when it just never will be, you know. You know, even with, like I say, hardware, when did I enjoy playing video games more, and when did I, like, really start to play console stuff more? When I had, like, a dedicated place to go for my video games, which was, you know, my Switch 2. So, as I say, there are use cases for everyone, and it's just a matter of finding what works the best for you, and once you do, it just kind of all clicks into place, I think. So, I think that's the thing overall. I say I don't hate emulators. I don't think there's any, like, right way to play video games. I don't think it's even, you know, worth discussing that or trying to definitively answer, because there will never be a way to make that work. And as you know, I know it keeps me playing, and I guess that's my main point of this video. And so I guess now I'll open up to anyone else who wants to start anything in the comments. So I guess my questions are, you know, do you emulate? Do you not emulate? Do you not like emulation? Do you prefer consoles? Do you not care? Do you kind of use them situationally like I do? Let me know in the comments. Let me know how you prefer to play. Let me know, you know, do you like just overall your thoughts on this topic, since I think this is a pretty interesting discussion, just because I think emulation is such a huge scene as is, and is only going to get more and more popular as time goes on. Meanwhile, there's still such a huge following around console themselves. So let me know in the comments, start a discussion as always, as I say, and I think that's really everything. So I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.